They say love is blind, but sometimes it's also the perfect disguise for a predator. In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, a 46-year-old woman sat at her kitchen table late at night, her laptop glowing softly in the dark. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was looking for companionship, a voice to ease the silence that had crept into her life after years of loneliness. That's when he appeared. Charming, attentive. His words were carefully chosen, designed to feel like warmth in the cold. He spoke of love, of destiny, of building a future together. And she believed him. Because everything about him felt real. But behind the sweet words and promises of forever, there was no man of integrity, no partner, no future. There was only a scammer, an invisible thief who knew exactly how to exploit the deepest parts of her heart. What began as late-night chats soon became desperate pleas for money. Small requests at first, then bigger ones. And before long, her life savings, her trust and her peace of mind were gone. This is not just the story of a scam, it is the story of how love turned into betrayal, how trust became a weapon, and how one woman's hope was used against her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read everyone. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. They called it a fairy tale beginning, but for her it would become the start of a nightmare. Her name was Elaine Carter. She was 46 years old, a woman who had lived most of her life quietly, working as a receptionist at a dental office, going home to an empty house and filling her evenings with books and late-night television. Friends described her as gentle, maybe too gentle. She trusted easily, and she longed for connection more than she ever admitted out loud. That longing was what opened the door. The tragedy wasn't a single moment. It was the slow, invisible theft of her security, her dignity, and her heart. It began with a message. A simple, "Hello, beautiful," from a man who claimed to be an American contractor stationed overseas. His name, he said, was Daniel. He was 52, widowed, and searching for someone who could heal the loneliness in his life. Elaine felt a spark. Not because his words were extraordinary, but because for the first time in years someone saw her. Someone cared enough to ask how her day was, to tell her she mattered. At first, she hesitated. But slowly, she let him in. The nightly conversations became her lifeline. She would rush home from work, open her laptop, and wait for his green light to turn on. Their talk stretched for hours, about life, about faith, about a future they swore they'd build together. Elaine began to smile again. Her co-workers noticed. Her father, her one surviving parent, said she seemed happier than he'd seen in years. But happiness in this case carried a heavy price. When Daniel spoke of his overseas projects, he painted vivid pictures. The danger, the challenges, the constant travel. He began to share small burdens. A delayed paycheck, a medical emergency, a sudden need for money to cover an urgent expense. At first, it was just a few $100s. Elaine wired it without question. After all, what were a few dollars compared to love? But soon, those requests grew. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Elaine dipped into her savings. She borrowed against her retirement. She sold jewelry her late mother had left behind. Each time Daniel promised it was temporary, that once they were together she would never have to worry again. Her father tried to intervene. One evening, noticing how tired she looked, he asked carefully, "Elaine, are you sure this man is who he says he is?" She smiled weakly and brushed it off. "Dad, you wouldn't understand. This is real." But even as she defended Daniel, a quiet fear began to take root. She noticed small inconsistencies, stories that didn't match, promises that never materialized. Yet, her heart clung to the bond. She had already given so much. How could she walk away now? Her isolation deepened. Friends stopped calling when she declined invitations. Her father's concern turned into silence. Her world was shrinking, down to one glowing screen, one man's voice, one relationship that consumed her entirely. And then came the moment that foreshadowed everything to come. One night, after sending another transfer, she sat alone at her kitchen table. The laptop still open, Daniel's last message still glowing on the screen. She whispered out loud, "If I lose him, I lose everything." It was more than a statement, it was a warning. Because when love becomes dependency, and dependency becomes survival, the line between devotion and destruction begins to blur. And for Elaine, that line was about to disappear. Elaine's outward calm was almost convincing. She smiled more at work. She started chatting casually with her father again. Even her neighbour remarked that she looked happier lately. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed Elaine had pushed past her jealousy. But appearances can be deceptive. Privately, Elaine was more entangled than ever. Her devotion had grown into obsession. She kept a hidden notebook, pages filled with Daniel's messages, the dates of every transfer, the promises he made, and the times he failed to show up. At first it read like a diary of love, but slowly her handwriting changed, sharper, angrier, filled with underlined words like forever, betrayal, and mine. Still, she played the role of the supportive partner. When Daniel mentioned Grace helping him with travel documents, Elaine responded sweetly, "That's wonderful. I'm glad she's looking after you until you come home." But as she typed those words, her hand trembled because she had already taken her own step in secret. The twist began quietly, with a second profile. Elaine had created a new account online, pretending to be someone else. Using a false name and a borrowed picture, she reached out to Daniel in disguise. She wanted to test him, to see if he would flirt or fall for another woman just as quickly as he had fallen for her. At first, she convinced herself it was harmless, just a way to ease her doubts. But when Daniel replied warmly to the stranger, thanking her for her kindness, something inside Elaine broke. She had her proof that his love was not unique, proof that she was not the only one. And that proof hardened her resolve. Yet the deception didn't stop there. Elaine also began contacting Grace directly. She found her email in the background of a message Daniel had forwarded. And one night, after hours of staring at the address, she wrote, "Do you know who Daniel really is? Because I do." She never hit send, but the draft stayed in her inbox, like a loaded weapon waiting for its moment. From that day forward, Elaine lived in two realities. In one, she was Daniel's loyal partner, sending him money, planning his return, filling her home with little touches of his imagined presence. In the other, she was a silent investigator, testing him, spying on him, preparing for the day she would expose everything. And yet, neither reality brought her peace. One evening, she set the table for two, his favorite dish, spaghetti and meatballs. She poured 2 glasses of wine and whispered to the empty chair, You'll see who truly loves you." The glass in front of her stayed untouched. And that night she scribbled one last entry in her notebook. "If he lies to me again, I will not just lose him, I will destroy him." Elaine believed she was finally taking back control, but in truth, her descent had only just begun. For weeks, Elaine lived in two shadows, the woman who waited for Daniel with patient devotion, and the woman who secretly doubted him, testing him with a false identity, replaying every inconsistency she uncovered. The conflict between those two selves only grew sharper as Daniel's return date approached. He spoke often of how Grace was helping him finalize his paperwork, how she was arranging things so his journey home would be smooth. On the surface, Elaine congratulated him, smiling through every call. But behind the smile, her chest tightened. Every mention of Grace wasn't reassurance, it was fuel. The notebook on her bedside table filled with darker entries. Some were questions. If he can lie once, how many times has he lied already? Others were blunt warnings. If I lose everything, he loses too. And then, the ritual began. Elaine started rehearsing their reunion in obsessive detail. She bought a new dress, navy blue, the color Daniel once said he loved. She stocked her pantry with the foods he claimed to miss from America. She placed his picture, printed from their chats, into a frame beside her bed. But alongside these preparations, she was planning something else, something private. On her laptop, she created a folder titled Truth. Inside it, she stored screenshots of their conversations, bank records of every transfer, and copies of the messages he had unknowingly sent to her fake profile. It was her secret weapon, evidence of betrayal, ready to be revealed. Still, she wasn't content with evidence alone. She wanted a plan. One evening, she cooked again. Spaghetti and meatballs, his favorite dish. But this time she recorded herself at the table speaking to the empty chair. "Daniel, when you come here, you'll never leave me again. Not for Grace, not for anyone." The recording was never sent, but the file stayed saved, hidden alongside her screenshots. By now, Elaine's behavior was slipping into contradiction. At work, she was unusually cheerful, even baking cookies for her co-workers. To her father, she spoke lovingly about how Daniel would soon be part of the family. To Daniel himself, she wrote endless messages of loyalty and devotion. But in private, her tone was different. Her final notebook entries were no longer about love. They were about endings. The last page, written in heavy strokes, read, "When he arrives, the truth arrives with him." The crime itself was not explosive. It wasn't sudden or bloody. It was, in many ways, painfully ordinary. Elaine didn't storm into an airport or confront Daniel face to face. Instead, she pressed send. One night, shaking, she returned to the email draft addressed to Grace. She reread it, adjusted the words, and then clicked. The subject line: "The man you're helping is a fraud." Attached to it was the folder she had titled Truth. Every bank slip, every screenshot, every secret file she had collected, evidence that would unravel Daniel's carefully crafted mask. The crime wasn't violence, the crime was exposure. Elaine's entire life had been poured into him. And now, in one act of desperation, she stripped away his disguise and burned the world they had built together. After sending the email, she closed her laptop and sat in silence. She expected guilt. Instead, she felt a strange calm. She had taken control. She had struck first. But the calm wouldn't last, because the ripples of her decision were only just beginning, and soon they would pull her into consequences she could never escape. When Elaine clicked send, she believed her story was over, that Daniel would disappear, Grace would confront him, and she would finally be free from the trap of love and lies. But stories rarely end so neatly. The email reached Grace within hours. At first she ignored it, assuming it was spam. But curiosity won. She opened the folder labeled Truth. What she found inside shocked her. Screenshots of conversations stretching for months. Bank receipts proving tens of thousands of dollars had been drained from Elaine's accounts. Even a video of Elaine whispering at her kitchen table, promising Daniel would never leave her again. Grace wasn't Daniel's assistant at all. She was another victim. Another woman caught in the same web of lies. And Elaine was not the only one. Grace forwarded the evidence to a local fraud hotline. Within weeks, federal investigators opened a file. They traced the IP addresses from Daniel's messages. They followed the bank transfers Elaine had documented so meticulously. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, revealing that Daniel wasn't a widowed American contractor at all, but part of an organized romance scam network based overseas. The investigation stretched across states and borders. Elaine was called in for questioning. For the first time, she sat in a sterile office, facing agents who spoke plainly. "You are not the only victim. There are dozens more. He never existed. None of it was real." The words hit harder than any betrayal before. She wept, not only for her stolen money, but for the life she had built in her mind. The future dinners, the promises of marriage, the hope of companionship, all of it crumbled into dust. Court documents revealed that the group had stolen millions from vulnerable victims. Elaine's transfers were only a fraction. Yet her meticulous records, the same notebook filled with desperate scribbles, became the key evidence prosecutors used to prove the scammer's intent. Her obsession, once her prison, had become the very weapon that brought him down. The trial was swift but painful. Elaine attended, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom. She listened as prosecutors read aloud passages from her own diary, words she had once written in secrecy. "If I lose him, I lose everything." She felt exposed, humiliated, but also vindicated. The sentencing was delivered with cold finality. Years behind bars for the men who orchestrated the scam, seized accounts, frozen assets. For Elaine, it was justice, but not redemption. Afterward, she returned to her father's home, quieter than ever. The neighbors noticed she no longer smiled, no longer waved across the street. She stopped attending gatherings. The weight of betrayal had reshaped her into someone unrecognizable. The last entry in her notebook was dated months later. Unlike the others, it wasn't filled with rage or longing, just a single line. "He never loved me, but I was the one who gave him the power to ruin me." That notebook now sits sealed in an evidence box, stored away with hundreds of others from similar cases, files that remind investigators of how easily trust can be weaponized. And Elaine, she lives quietly, still in Ohio, still working at the same dental office. Her father remains her closest companion, but every time her phone buzzes with a new message, she hesitates before opening it. Because once you've been betrayed by a voice you trusted, you never hear words the same way again. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear about our next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.